He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Because when Zohran Mamdani stepped between the officer and the man with the bleeding lip, the entire terminal froze. "Step back, sir," the officer snapped. But Zohran didn't move. He raised his voice, calm, even, firm. "Do you know who you're humiliating?" The officer faltered, just for a breath, because something in Zohran's tone didn't match the chaos. Something in his presence said, "You've already gone too far." How does a simple boarding question spiral into public shame? How does a man with a valid ticket and a clean record end up being shoved, searched, and silenced, while everyone else looks away? And what happens when the one person who refuses to look away holds power? It started, as it always does, with something small. A smirk, a dismissive glance, a delayed response at the gate. The man's name was Farid, a tech consultant returning home after a funeral in Berlin. He wore a navy suit, held a worn leather briefcase, and had sorrow stitched into his silence. His boarding pass scanned fine, but the agent didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even explain. "You've been flagged," she finally said. "For what?" Farid asked, voice low. The agent looked up, sharp now. "Sir, step aside." There was no reason, no explanation, just the eyes of 5 officers now watching a man who hadn't done anything, but ask why. Farid wasn't loud. He wasn't combative. But the moment he asked twice, he became a threat. And threats must be dealt with. People around started filming, but it was already too late. Farid was pulled to the side, against the glass wall near gate 17B. His papers were scattered, his bag unzipped, clothes pushed aside like garbage. And then, the officer raised his voice. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Farid flinched, because this wasn't about a bag, it was about control. And then came the push. The crowd gasped, quiet but collective. A smear of blood darkened Farid's cheek as he stumbled forward. But he didn't raise his voice either. He just stood, stunned, humiliated. And that's when Zohran Mamdani walked in. He hadn't planned to be there. His flight was delayed. He was only passing through. But the moment he saw Farid, the blood, the silence, the powerlessness, he stopped walking. And everything inside him said, "No, not today." Now Zohran stood between Farid and the uniform, not yelling, not flinching, just present. The kind of presence that makes people nervous when they know they've gone too far. "I'm Assemblyman Mamdani," he said, slow and clear, "from New York's 36th District, and I just watched you assault a civilian." Silence. The officer looked around, suddenly unsure. Cameras were still rolling. The gate agent, who had smirked, now stood frozen, pale. "Sir," the officer tried again. He was uncooperative. Zohran didn't blink. He asked a question. "That's not a crime." Another officer stepped in, whispering quickly to the first. There was shuffling, a ripple of second thoughts. But it was too late. The cameras had caught it. The blood was visible. And Zohran, he wasn't going anywhere. "I need your name," Zohran said, "and the name of your superior." This wasn't about theatrics. It wasn't about headlines. It was about accountability, finally demanded by someone who wasn't afraid of being ignored. That's the thing about silence. It's easy to dismiss until someone powerful breaks it. And today, Zohran Mamdani was the one who refused to let that silence swallow another man. Farid leaned against the wall, trying to breathe. His dignity had been shredded in public, but as Zohran stood beside him, it began stitching itself back together. And the question now wasn't what happened. It was who else has this happened to? And why does it keep happening at all? If you've ever felt powerless in a place you paid to be, If you've ever been talked down to because you looked wrong, then you know. This moment wasn't just about Farid. This was about all of us. Share this story if you've ever watched someone get treated like less, for no reason at all. And don't forget to subscribe, because these stories need to be told, especially when the world wants them quiet. Farid sat in the airport's medical office now, a thin gauze pressed to the cut on his cheek. His hands were steady, but his eyes couldn't stop scanning the past 20 minutes. Like his brain was still trying to file it under misunderstanding instead of what it really was, public degradation. And outside that small glass room, Zohran Mamdani hadn't moved an inch. The officers were whispering now, just like before. But this time, the whisper wasn't about suspicion. It was about consequence. Zohran stood with his arms folded, still in front of the gate desk. The same agent who had flagged Farid now stared at her computer screen as if it might somehow erase what she did. It couldn't. "I want documentation," Zohran said. "Everything. The report, the timestamp, the call log from when you escalated a routine question into an incident." A security supervisor tried to deflect. "Sir, we're conducting an internal—" "Not enough," Zohran interrupted. "I want names. I want policies. I want the part of your training manual that tells you curiosity is aggression." Passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to watch. One man stood with his arms crossed, lips tight. A mother, holding her toddler, whispered to a flight attendant, "That could have been my husband." The attendant didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. And that's when Zohran pulled out his phone. Not to call for backup, not to take a photo, but to record a voice memo. He spoke plainly, clearly into the mic. Date, March 18th. Location, JFK Terminal 2. Incident, targeted detainment and physical aggression against civilian passenger Farid Aslam. I witnessed the entire event. My name is Zohran Mamdani. I will not let this be buried. And suddenly, everything changed. Because people recognized the name. Not everyone, but enough. Zohran wasn't just another bystander with a camera. He was a lawmaker. And worse, for them, he was the kind who shows up when it's uncomfortable. That's when the airline manager finally arrived. Hair out of place, shirt slightly wrinkled, damage control written across his face. He looked at the officers, the agents, and finally, Zohran. "Assemblyman Mamdani, we deeply regret." "Stop," Zohran said. "Save the PR script. I want to know who made the decision to mark Mr. Aslam for secondary review." The manager blinked. "That's part of a broader screening process." Zohran stepped forward, calm but razor sharp. "Did anyone else from that line get flagged?" "Sir, I don't have that information." "You will," Zohran said. "Because I'm not asking as a passenger. I'm asking as a public official who just watched you brutalize a man for no reason." The crowd was growing. Phones were up again. And this time they weren't watching a victim. They were watching a reckoning. The manager cleared his throat. "We'll, be offering Mr. Aslam compensation." "Compensation?" Zohran's voice cracked like thunder across linoleum. "He's not a lost bag. He's a human being." Farid stepped out from the medical room. The gauze was gone now, but the swelling under his eye was visible. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way a person shrinks when they've been made to feel like nothing. But when he saw Zohran, when he saw the crowd watching, waiting, he stood up straighter. Zohran turned to him. "I'm here. You don't have to say a word. I'll speak for both of us." Farid shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Let me say it." And with that, Farid stepped forward, in front of the desk, in front of the agents, in front of every pair of eyes still watching. "I asked why my seat was changed," he began. They couldn't answer, so they made me a problem. His voice didn't shake. I cooperated. I followed every word they said, and they still treated me like I was a threat. He turned toward the agent. I want you to understand something. That wasn't fear you acted on. That was bias. Silence again. The kind of silence that demands reflection. The kind that wraps itself around shame and doesn't let go. Zohran stepped beside him, then spoke loud enough for every person in the terminal to hear. This is what happens when we normalize humiliation, when asking why becomes suspicious, when brown skin equals danger in someone's handbook. He pointed to the gate agent. You didn't just target a man. You targeted an idea that someone like him should stay quiet, that someone like him should know better than to speak. The manager looked pale now. The officers were shifting on their feet, and in the background, someone whispered, I hope this goes viral. But for Zohran, that was never the point. He didn't want fame. He wanted change. If you've ever been profiled, silenced, or dismissed, if you've ever watched someone's humanity be reduced to a protocol, then you know how this feels. These stories aren't rare. They're just rarely witnessed by someone who can do something about it. If this moved you, say something in the comments, because silence protects power. And your voice might be the one that finally breaks the cycle. The apology came, eventually. It wasn't sincere, it wasn't even specific. Just a printed sheet of corporate language handed to Farid by a junior representative who couldn't even look him in the eye. We regret the inconvenience caused during your travel experience, it read. That was it. Inconvenience. As if he'd missed a snack cart, not been profiled, publicly searched, and pushed to the ground. Zohran read the paper twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. Is that all? He asked the representative. The man blinked. I believe so, sir. Zohran turned to Farid. Do you want to leave? Farid nodded. I just want to go home. And so they did. But not before Zohran pulled out a second phone, the one his office used for official documentation, and snapped a photo of the apology notice. Because this wasn't over. Later that evening, back in his hotel room overlooking Manhattan, Zohran didn't sleep. He sat at the desk with his laptop open, a folder of airport footage, passenger testimonies, timestamps, and policy documents spread out in front of him like evidence in a trial. Because it was one, not against a person, but against a culture. He watched the video again. Farid standing still, the agent waving over security, the moment the officer shoved him without provocation. The blood. And then he pulled up his own footage, the one with his voice naming the date, the location, the incident. He played that back too. It still made his chest tighten, because this wasn't about optics. It was about something he'd seen before, too many times. His own mother being followed at a department store. His college friend denied a hotel check-in because the ID looked fake. The student who told him last year she stopped flying home for holidays because TSA made her cry every time. They called them isolated cases. But Zohran knew better. This wasn't an error, it was a pattern. And now he had the receipts. The next morning, he drafted a letter, not to the airline, not to the TSA, but to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in Congress. The title was blunt: Racial Bias in Public Transit Spaces, a Federal Oversight Failure. He didn't soften the language, didn't code it in diplomacy. He wrote, "When people of color are treated like suspects first and humans second, the system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as it was trained to. The difference in Farid Aslam's case is that someone was watching. Most aren't so lucky." He attached the footage, the photos, the transcript from his voice memo. He CC'd civil rights organizations, legal advocacy groups, and 5 local journalists he trusted. And then, he did something most politicians wouldn't. He posted it online. No grand caption, just, What happened to Farid Aslam happens every day. Here's proof. Let's fix it. Within hours, it was everywhere. Comments poured in, not just of support, but of shared pain. A high school teacher from Texas wrote, "I've been stopped 3 out of the last 4 times I've flown. My only offense? A hijab." A retired Marine posted, "I served this country for 20 years, still get pulled for random screening every time. Proud of you for speaking up, Assemblyman." An elderly woman said, "It happened to my grandson. He just stood there and cried while they unpacked his toys like contraband." Zohran read every word, and the more he read, the more he realized. This wasn't about one gate, one flight, one moment. It was about the invisible wall some people hit, everywhere they go. And maybe this time, the camera had caught it. But how many times had it happened in silence? Farid messaged him that night. Not a long message, just one line. "Thank you for seeing me when they didn't." Zohran stared at it for a long time, because that's what it came down to. Not just policy, not just reform, but presence. Choosing to see people when they're being erased. If this story resonates with you, even a little, leave a comment. Because silence isn't safety, and dignity should never require documentation. You can help push stories like this forward. Subscribe for more, not just for politics, but for people. By midweek, the pressure had become too loud to ignore. The airline issued a second apology. This time, they named him Farid Aslam. They used words like deeply regret and unacceptable treatment. They said they would review internal procedures and enhance bias training. But to Zohran, it read like something written after a fire, not to extinguish it, but to shield themselves from the smoke. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he waited. Waited until the hearing date was confirmed. Waited until the civil rights groups had confirmed attendance. Waited until Farid himself gave one quiet, steady yes. "I'll testify." It wasn't for revenge. It wasn't for drama. It was for something deeper, so people couldn't say they didn't know anymore. The congressional subcommittee room in D.C. was cold, carpeted, and crowded. Zohran walked in first, not as a headline, not as the man who went viral, but as a representative of the people, people who had stories, but no microphones. He took his seat, and then Farid entered, no longer the man with the bloodied lip, now dressed in the same navy suit, head high, voice calm. When asked what happened, he didn't dramatize it, he just told the truth. "I asked about my seat," he said. "I was pushed, searched, dismissed. They never asked for an explanation, because they didn't think they owed me one." You could hear the air change in the room. It wasn't loud, it was sharp, focused. When Zohran was called to speak, he didn't read from notes. He didn't need to. "This isn't about one gate," he said. "It's about the way power is handed to people who aren't trained to hold it. It's about the way some bodies are treated as burdens, as risks, as disruptions, just for showing up." He looked at the committee, then at the cameras, then directly into the lens of the country watching. We say we value dignity, then we allow it to be stripped away in silence, under fluorescent lights, with no one held accountable. A few heads nodded. One congresswoman wiped her eye. Another leaned in, finally listening, not just hearing. When the hearing ended, Zohran didn't stay for the press. He walked outside, onto the Capitol steps. Farid was beside him. They said little, but they didn't need to, because something had shifted. Later that night, back in New York, Zohran sat at his small kitchen table. He was alone. He opened his email. There were hundreds of messages, but one stood out. Subject line, "I'm 17. I saw what you did." The message read, "My dad is Egyptian. He doesn't talk about the things that happened to him at airports. But I saw him cry when we watched the video of you standing up for Farid. He said someone finally understood. I want to be like that too. Zohran closed the laptop and sat in silence. Not heavy, not defeated, just present. This wasn't the end. Not for Farid, not for the others, and not for Zohran. Because power isn't about status. It's about choosing to use your voice when staying quiet would be safer. It's about showing up in the moment someone else is being erased. It's about refusing to look away. The next morning, Zohran stood in front of his staff. "We're not done," he said. "We take this to the airports, to transit boards, to union tables. If they're willing to fix it, we help them. And if they're not, we keep telling the story until they can't ignore it anymore." He paused, then smiled, not because it was easy, but because he knew it was right. Farid's story wasn't rare. It was just finally seen. And that's how change begins. If this story made you feel seen, share it. If you've been silent before, it's okay. But let today be different. Speak. Comment. Subscribe. Because voices like yours, ours, are what turn stories into movements. And sometimes, the quietest act of courage is just refusing to look away.